Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Global Women in Security Alliance 2020. My next guest, Samantha Korta. She's with Deloitte & Touche, and Katie Mason of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. They have a great presentation for us today about an MIT study that found false news spreads faster, farther, deeper, and more broadly than the truth. So let's get started.
7 years, almost 8 years have passed since a deranged gunman entered an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut and opened fire, leaving 26 dead, 20 of which were children. 7 years, and the victims and the families of the victims and the officers, firefighters, paramedics, and other emergency staff who responded on that fateful day are still experiencing the aftermath. 7 years is not enough time to recover from such a loss in its own right. But on top of that, there were death threats, court cases, and a growing number of online communities who believe this tragedy never even happened. This is not the first, nor will it be the last. But this one in particular underscores why we, as national security practitioners, but also as citizens and as parents, should care about the role conspiracy theories, fake news, and lies play in our daily lives. Not only because we have seen this manifest in the aftermath as a way to help explain away physical violence, like in Sandy Hook, but also as the very catalyst for physical violence, like we saw at Christchurch, a mass murder generated and brought to you by the internet. And Katie and I, we have a model to help us wrap our heads around this very difficult, complex issue. And it's built on a money laundering metaphor to help us understand why. Information laundering is the process by which the interconnectedness of the internet is used to normalize false or extremely biased information until that original source of that information is lost and the underlying narrative becomes a part of public discourse. This process can translate into physical threats. It can erode trust in government, military, and educational institutions. It can discourage our foreign diplomacy and distort international and domestic opinions. We break information laundering down into 3 phases. Just like in money laundering, there's placement, layering, and integration. Within layering, the middle, there are 3 subcomponents: enablers, accelerators, and amplifiers. You don't need accelerators and amplifiers to information launder, but they certainly make it easier. In the placement phase, the very first phase, the content and the design of the message is taken into consideration. We refer to it as a counterfeit narrative, and it's built in such a way that it's developed to persuade the user of its truthfulness, but also to achieve maximum speed and virility online. Actors leverage existing cognitive biases, persuasion techniques, and the inherently social nature of humanity to help the counterfeit narrative achieve maximum effect and impact. This is often where you'll see things like deepfakes come into fruition. In layering, the counterfeit narrative is connected, it's dropped into the internet ecosystem through one or more enablers. Enablers are more than just social media sites. They can be search engines, news and/or research sites, blogs and discussion forums, and then effort to leverage the inherent interconnectedness of the internet. The content travels around these different enablers, and that interconnectedness becomes a legitimizing factor when those illegitimate narratives and those sources are passed through and shared among legitimate ones. Once the counterfeit narrative is inserted, it can be disseminated even more rapidly through the introduction of accelerators. Those are online actors or mechanisms like targeted advertising, trolls, bots, used to spread counterfeit narratives faster, farther, and more frequently. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion around accelerators especially, and how the internet and many social media platforms have actually been incentivized to spread disinformation and fake news faster. And then on top of that, we've got secondary actors referred to as amplifiers who may spread content even further by taking advantage of an existing information laundering campaign to exploit tension, anger, or fear, either for ideological, political, or financial purposes. Finally, in the integration phase, that counterfeit narrative is normalized, often with the original source and the context of the content lost. It's anonymized and it leaves the overall message part of public discourse. And we start talking about it as if it's something that we've always talked about.
So we wanted to take the time to unpack some of those mechanisms that Sam was referring to. And one of the first things that we saw when we started talking about disinformation a few years ago was bots. Nefarious actors can use bots as an automated way to push out as much content as possible as quickly as possible. And they can also use things like trolls. Trolls are the people online that are there to just stir the pot and further antagonize any conversations online. But as social media companies get better at detecting trolls and bots on their platforms, we're starting to see a shift to some of these other mechanisms that you see on the screen. I won't be able to go through all of them, but one of the ones that we really want to highlight that we're seeing a shift to is deep fakes. Deep fakes is content generated by AI that can be audio, video, or photos. And as technology improves, these deep fakes become more and more difficult to tell what is real and what is fake. One of the other ones that we like to talk about is echo chambers. Echo chambers are the things that we see every single day on the devices and the platforms that we use. In order to triage all of the information that we see on a daily basis, there are algorithms built into these systems, which mean that you're typically only seeing the content that you're most likely to engage with. And this is oftentimes for a marketing purpose, but the more this happens, the less we see differing perspectives. And then we want to talk about human cognitive biases. As humans, we are more likely to share and engage with new, novel, and exciting information rather than sometimes the truth. And this leads to a phenomenon where fake information tends to travel faster than true information. And then we have things like social media influencers. There's a whole science behind social media influencers to drive engagement, followers, and legitimacy. And again, this is mostly intended for marketing purposes, but this can be leveraged by nefarious actors to spread a false narrative in a legitimate and powerful way. And lastly, we have micro-targeting. Micro-targeting is the identification of very specific demographics of people and crafting a narrative that is going to be relatable and aligns with the beliefs of that group of people. So we always like to come back to what can be done about this problem. It can largely seem very overwhelming and at times seem like a very difficult challenge to overcome. But one thing that I really want to point out is that this is not just a social media company problem. This is not just a federal government problem. And we really need to start accepting disinformation as a larger standalone threat rather than a component of other threats that we face, such as election security. So the first thing that we can do about it is start building awareness about this problem and also accept that it might impact our operations and our missions as national security professionals. And part of creating awareness about it is understanding and educating yourself about the resources that are available to you, such as training and different flyers that you can provide to your communities and your personnel. And these resources are only growing. There are academics and civil society organizations that are dedicating full-time resources to making sure that these are available to you. And we should also consider existing practices and systems in our worlds that can be leveraged to mitigate disinformation. And we should also look to international efforts. The European Union and Finland are often cited as an example for combating disinformation well, and we should learn from their challenges and their successes and apply them here at home. It's not perfect, but it might be a good start.
And when we think about this, it's important to kind of approach it at multiple angles. And it's not just about understanding disinformation. And it's not even probably about understanding the one step up, the general erosion of trust that we're experiencing. And it is a standalone threat, and we need to tackle it and consider it from both sides, from both supply and demand. There have been many steps taken to address the supply for disinformation, the access to fake news. We see content providers and social platforms take down false content all the time. We've seen them update their policies and their terms of service to adapt to this evolving threat. Recently, we've seen the social media platforms attempt to mitigate the risk of deepfakes by banning any content that's AI generated with an intent to mislead an average person into thinking a subject said words they did not actually say, or an event occurred that did not actually happen. But the very way that that policy is written helps ban deepfakes, but it doesn't ban things like shallow fakes or cheap fakes, which are just videos that are already selectively edited or out of context snippets that humans are very adept at creating, spreading, and believing. This brings us to the demand for disinformation. It's more than just the ability, our capability of spreading false narratives. Research shows there's a general demand for disinformation, and it's tied to the psychology of how we consume information and form opinions. We actually go out looking for disinformation. Katie mentioned that false information travels faster than truth. That's because we demand novelty and things that elicit emotion. And a lot of times, false information is novel. So we need to look at things like inoculation and education to be part of our response efforts. We need to understand what narratives may circulate within our area of responsibility or discipline, and we try to get ahead of the messages now before we need them. We also need to educate not only our populations, but our personnel and ourselves. We need to make sure we understand that none of us are immune to this issue and take a step back when we are evaluating content ourselves.
So, building on what Sam was talking about with education and training, there are two interactive games online that I like to make sure people are aware about that anyone from a small child up to your grandmother can play. And they're based on the inoculation theory. And it works by exposing you to how disinformation works and what it looks like. So, when you encounter it in the real world, you're a little bit more resilient to it. And we also need to consider things like closing our cyber skill set gaps. We need people that are educated and with these skills to help us attribute disinformation campaigns, track them, and mitigate them. And then we also need to look at our public communication. A lot of us have been very slow to evolve to the social media world, and we're still a couple steps behind. And unfortunately, posting on social media just isn't enough anymore. And Sam's going to talk a little bit more about creative ways that we can use social media to communicate with the public.
So, to comment further on what Katie was talking about sometimes are often antiquated public messaging practices. There are influencers online right now in your organization with hundreds of thousands of followers who can leverage their truth and their own narratives. Like, I grew up hating the police. Now I am a police officer. Think of these types of individuals and who they may relate to. Are those the kinds of communities your organizations may seek to reach? These influencers are not already messaging on behalf of some of your agencies, whether they have approval or not. Thinking how to use them effectively to help share information and establish positive relationships within communities now, before the next crisis, this might be critical so that when that crisis happens, those same communities are coming to you for truth. We've also seen examples of law enforcement officers, for example, that use their platforms to de-escalate tension online. For example, a small town police chief with a very strong following on LinkedIn took an opportunity a while back to counter the message of a trending hashtag that resulted from an incident that occurred at a popular coffee chain when it kicked out law enforcement officers out of its establishment. When that happened, a hashtag boycott that establishment started a trend, and the chief, recognizing his own influence, used his platform to suggest that just as law enforcement does not benefit when one officer's actions are generalized to the entire law enforcement community, that same consideration should be made before generalizing one employee's actions to that of an entire 300,000 person company. This social media influencer leveraged a trending narrative, admittedly pro-law enforcement, in his favor, and rather than feeding the fire, he encouraged his fellow officers to use it as a teaching moment to highlight our understanding that one employee does not represent the whole. We need to consider how these influencers and those like them may be the new pathways to our institutional legitimacy. legitimacy through people, imperfect and human, who work within them.
None of us are above this issue. As humans, we are all susceptible to this problem. So we challenge you to all start the conversation in your agencies and take a hard look at how disinformation might impact you and consider how you can be better prepared to mitigate those impacts.
Remembering Christ Church and Sandy Hook, we need to be better, not only for the memory of the children who died, but for those who we set an example for each day, for those who survive. In a world full of conspiracy theories, fake news, and lies perpetuated by bad actors, nation states, and bots, we as national security professionals cannot fight this fight alone, but we can certainly set an example and we can hold ourselves to a higher standard. We need to plant the seeds now that will grow into the solutions for the future.
So this was just a very condensed version of some of the research Sam and I have done over the past couple of years. And we were really excited to have the opportunity to speak to this audience about some of the experiences that we have had as females in law enforcement. And as you know, law enforcement is still a very male-dominated field. And as a female, this can be very difficult to navigate sometimes. But what I really want everyone to take away from this today is that it's really important that we push through that negativity or some of those challenges that you experience as a female, because we have a lot to bring to the table in terms of national security. And so I just want to share two really quick experiences with all of you that I've had to hopefully demonstrate the importance and the value of all this. And the first story is that early on in my career, I had a lot of leadership start recognizing some of the good work that I was doing. And because they recognized my good work, I started getting a lot of really cool opportunities. I received some awards, and they knew me on a first name basis. And this is in an agency of like 2,000 people. And so this was kind of unprecedented being a civilian in a law enforcement agency, especially being a female. And unfortunately, with all this success and opportunities that came, many of my coworkers and peers began to attribute this success to the fact that I was a young female and these leaders that were recognizing my work were male. And so they just assumed that perhaps there were some inappropriate things happening behind closed doors. This was never, in fact, the case. And I just was able to ignore that and keep moving and keep doing what I was doing and not let that get me down. I ultimately left that agency, and at the agency I'm at now, I'm much happier. And part of the reason that I'm much happier and I've been able to build on my success at this agency that I'm at now is because I've had really great female mentors. And I didn't realize the importance of these female mentors until I stopped and reflected and prepared for this presentation. And I just want to tell you about two of the really important figures in my life. And the first one, she's my direct supervisor. She's a police lieutenant, and she has been in law enforcement for 25, 30 years, and she's actually getting ready to retire, which makes me very sad. But during her time as my supervisor, she has done nothing but put in every single effort to depart her knowledge and experiences to me and encourage me and empower me in my position. And that has meant the world to me. And I've grown so much in this position, and I've been afforded so many opportunities that I might have never had, especially at the last job that I was at, where they were trying to hold me back with some of that negativity. And the second mentor is Sam, the person I'm here speaking today. She actually inspired me to tackle this research topic of disinformation, which has been nothing but a challenge for me. And not only did she inspire me to do this, but she now works alongside me. And she encourages me, she teaches me new things, and she also pushes me to make sure that my work product and that myself is the best that it can be. Without Sam, one, I wouldn't be here talking today, and two, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. So thank you, Sam. And to all the female mentors out there, keep doing what you're doing, because you have no idea how much value and impact you have on some of these young women's lives.
It's funny because Katie brings up as being a female in law enforcement, but more broadly in my career, I'm at that point where I have transitioned from being a young adult to being an adult in the room, and I'm a mentor now. And that's something that even to this day, I struggle with because I just constantly learn from everybody. So I didn't realize until recently that I had moved into a position where I really needed to be an example to the folks coming in that are, the next generation after me. And one thing I should note is I would say the trifecta, but it's probably even worse than that. So when I started my career, which was, to be clear, 15 years ago, I had the trifecta of being young and non-sworn and female in a law enforcement environment. And I still carry the young because I look young, even though I am not young anymore. When you check the box, I'm actually no longer a young adult. And I just realized that the other day. So it's just amazing to know that both the work that I've done and the people who came before me to open doors for me has been able to give back then to the folks like Katie, who I didn't even know I was doing anything. But I think that's where just the authenticity and the sincerity of women in this field, but in the broader national security field, I think is just really important. I also think it's important to note that just like fake news, just like truth, this isn't a black and white issue. It's not binary. We don't, it's not all, males are doing something wrong and the females are perfect. There are certainly females that contribute to the issues that we experience. In fact, there are those who have opened doors widely, walked through them, and then shut them behind for everyone else. And so I think it's important to continue to really understand where we fit into the broader national security enterprise, and also as females, how we should be reaching out and just inspiring both male and female in terms of what leadership should look like. I've also, like Katie, had the experience of working with some really amazing both male and female leaders, as well as some not so great leaders, and all of that has kind of shaped me in terms of who I am. I think one thing, and I'm sure for those talking about this issue, there's probably several of us that I struggle with, is something that I think is called imposter syndrome, which is I'm always questioning how I got to where I am or what I'm doing. When I publish something or when I speak on something, I question why I'm there, and that I'm just there, because I'm lucky and not because I've earned anything like that. And part of that is due to the fact that when you don't see many examples of people like you in places you work with your shared background or that look like you succeeding in your field, it causes you to question if you should be there. And so I think that compounding, just being in an environment that was very heavily dominated by people who just didn't look like me, contributed to it. I would not do anything differently, because what it has created in me is a resiliency and just a scrappiness that I bring to every situation. I can pretty much deal with every personality type I've been in, every situation you can possibly imagine. And I think the biggest thing that is probably missing in our world today, regardless of what gender we're talking about, is empathy. And I think when you go through these experiences like Katie did and that I've had as well, you just start to develop empathy for your fellow citizens. And I think that's pretty important, especially now, given everything we just talked about, when we've got a real existential threat to our democracy and to our freedom. We really need to be empathetic. And as I mentioned, it's not a binary issue. We need to understand that there is going to be gray parts of this conversation. And if we can do that and come together and have a conversation, we'll really start kind of overcoming some of the challenges that we're experiencing right now as a nation.